The following is part of Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series under the Cornell East Asia program. The arguments and viewpoints of this talk belong solely to the speaker. We hope you enjoy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Cornell Contemporary China Initiative Lecture Series. My name is Mara Du. I teach Qing and Republican China at the Department of History at Cornell. I'm serving as the director of the CCCI series in spring 2023 with the theme In General China. Founded in 2015, this lecture series has brought hundreds of leading scholars on China from various disciplinary backgrounds to share their cutting-edge research with Cornell students, faculty, and the general public. This series is sponsored by the East Asia program. Here, I would love to express my sincere gratitude to our co-sponsors, the Department of Asian Studies, Cornell Center for Social Sciences, the Feminist, Gender, and Sexuality Studies program, the Department of History, ILR School's Global Labor Institute, the Levinson China and Asia Pacific Studies program, and the Cornell Society for the Humanities. Before we formally start, I want to announce our next EAP event and the next CCCI talk. So next EAP event will be by Professor Yoshiko Okuyama on her new book, on her new book on Manka and the memory of mental health in Japan. That would be on Wednesday, March the 9th. No? Thursday. Now.
That are improper.
Okay, Thursday, March 9th at 4:30 p.m. in person at the same location. And then our next CCCI event will be on April the 20th by Professor Matthew Summer, who visits from Stanford University to talk about transgender in late imperial China case studies from the Qing archives. Unlike other CCCI events this semester, Professor Summers' CCCI talk will be on a Thursday, April the 20th, and it will be followed by a Cornell Classical Chinese colloquium on Friday, April the 21st at Rockefeller Hall 374 at 3:30 p.m. It's a great honor for me to introduce our speaker today. Professor Wang Xian is an assistant professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures at the University of Notre. Professor Wang received her PhD in East Asian Languages and Cultures from the University of Michigan in 2018. Her research and teaching interests encompass modern Chinese literature, film, popular culture, gender, and memory studies. Her current book project, Flesh and Stone, Negotiating Memories of Chinese Female Revolutionary Martyrs, examines how contested fictional and historical records, stone monuments, and artistic representations of female martyrdom form the national memory. She just submitted her manuscript, and congratulations. Professor Wang is also the author of multiple peer-reviewed and public-facing articles, and she is working on 2 separate book projects. Very exciting. So since spring 2022, the CCCI series has been held both in person on campus and broadcasted online via Zoom. For those who are attending the lecture via Zoom today, please type in your comments and questions into the chat box anytime during the lecture or during the Q&A. We will cover them during our Q&A session following the lecture. The recording of this lecture will be made available online after the talk. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues, classmates, and friends if they cannot make it today due to schedule conflict. Now let us welcome Professor Wang Xian with warm applause.
Thank you.
And Professor Wang, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. So thank you, Professor Du Yue, for your kind introduction. Also, I want to thank Amala Lane for helping me with all the logistics and for making this happen. I'm also grateful for this opportunity to give the talk during the Women's History Month to raise the awareness of comfort women issue. This talk was also inspired by our Cornell East Asian Studies community, which supported the memory projects back in 2016 to preserve the memory of a great famine in China. So I'm honored to be here at Cornell to join the discussion on gendered violence and how to preserve unspeakable memory. More specifically, I want to talk about how to remember wartime sexual violence and so-called comfort women. So before addressing these questions, I want to give you some background, some context for my research on the representations of comfort women in Chinese literature and film. So this is a byproduct of my recently finished book manuscript titled Flesh and Stone, an Imaginary Museum for Chinese Female Revolutionary Martyrs. So it is an interdisciplinary project on gendered violence and national memory in modern China. It examines the commemorations and narratives of female revolutionary sacrifices in modern China. And it also investigates the shift from female chaste martyrdom to female revolutionary martyrdom. It considers how this kind of advocacy of female martyrdom actually supports or questions state ideologies. So one of the chapters in this book manuscript is centered around a famous Chinese female author, Ding Ning's short story, When I Was in Xia Village. For those of you who are not quite familiar with this short story, When I Was in Xia Village tells the story of this village girl who is abducted by the Japanese army to serve as a sex slave. And then she later works for the Chinese Communist Party as a spy to collect intelligence on Japanese troops. So it's a classic short story we usually include in our modern Chinese literature class or a course on gender politics in modern China. But I always find it's hard for me to explain who Zhen Zhen is to our students. So usually when teaching these short stories, the emphasis is on the controversies surrounding the author Ding Ning's writings during the Yan'an rectification movement in 1940s and anti-rightist movement in the 1950s. So Zhen Zhen, this female protagonist, is simply referred to as a sex spy or military prostitute. Every time when I bring up that Zhen Zhen is actually a comfort woman, a victim of the Japanese military sexual slavery system, most of my students, they haven't heard about this term before. So during World War II, hundreds, thousands of young women across Asia, they actually they were forced to serve as comfort women, so-called comfort women. So I want to first clarify the term a little bit because the term itself is deceiving. So it is a euphemism which refers to who are forced to provide sexual services to Japanese army, specifically during World War II. It is deceiving because for the victims, there was no comfort but sufferings. It is doubly deceptive given that most of the comfort women, they were not adults, but teenage girls or even younger. So I'm only using this term here in my talk because it is still widely recognized as a term which refers to the victim of victim of the comfort women system. So starting from my research on the short story When I Was in Xia Village, I actually found out that there are many other literary works on comfort women in Chinese wartime literature from 1930s to 1940s. But they are still understudied, especially in English scholarship. And additionally, most of the scholarship on comfort women they provided from a perspective of history, political science, or legal studies, not so much in literary studies or in literature, especially in Chinese literature. So in today's talk, I want to talk about the literary representations of comfort women from Chinese literature in the 1930s and 40s, as well as two recent documentaries on comfort women survivors in China, focusing on one common motif in these literary works and films, the voices. I want to explore how the individual voices of comfort women can be included in the collective memory, and how should we remember wartime sexual violence. I want to start with introducing the first Western-style opera in China titled Akiko, which actually depicts a Japanese comfort woman in wartime China. So in June 1938, there was a news report published in 抗战文艺 titled Japanese Soldiers in Yangzhou Commit Suicide. So the author reported that there was this 26-year-old Japanese soldier committed suicide by slitting his own throat. On the same night, Akiko, a Japanese girl, committed suicide by hanging herself at a comfort station in Yangzhou. So according to the report, there were many so-called comfort stations full of Japanese girls and abducted Chinese girls to fulfill the sexual needs of the Japanese soldiers. So one day, this Japanese soldier went to this comfort station in Yangzhou and found out that his wife, Akiko, is actually the newly recruited comfort woman. The two committed suicide as a result of the feelings of shame. So in 1939, based on multiple reports on tragic death of Akiko and her husband, Chen Ding wrote a play titled Akiko, for which Wang composed the songs. And then Zhang Yuyuan and Li Jia wrote the lyrics. So that was the first Western-style opera ever written and performed in China. So the opera was first performed in China in Chongqing by China Experimental Opera Group on January 31st, 1942. It was a huge success. The political leaders and the intellectuals, such as Zhou Enlai and Guo Moruo, were among the audience and spoke highly of the opera. So it's worth noting that in this operatic version of the story, Akiko died for protecting her husband rather than committing suicide. And her husband later joined Chinese army to fight against the Japanese. So it delivers very strong anti-war messages. With Akiko singing on stage, actually this opera presents the voices of Japanese comfort women. And then next one, because the popularity of this opera, the script and the music notations of it was published in October 1942. Another example is that in 2014, the Nanjing Art Academy recovered the music score of the opera and performed it in Nanjing. And then later in 2015, they performed it in Edinburgh to bring the voice of comfort women to the international stage. Another example I want to give in terms of the representations of Japanese comfort women in wartime China is Xie Bingying's short story, The Girl Wumeko. For us to understand the author Xie Bingying's writing during the wartime, I want to give you some background information. Xie Bingying was one of the women who actually passed a rigorous exam to study at the prestigious Huangpu Military Academy in Wuhan in 1926. It was transgressive and controversial for women to join the army at the time, so Xie Bingying was a pioneer. And after finishing her military training in Wuhan, she joined the army on the front lines. And she kept a diary while she was in the army about her experience in the army. And then the diaries were first published in the supplement to the Central Daily, 中央日报副刊. And they were later translated into English by Lin Yutang. The diary collection was published in 1929 and generated heated discussions. In 1936, she published the autobiography of a female soldier. So the two books, they are quite influential in the history of modern Chinese literature, and they also provide first-hand materials about war and revolution in China through the eyes of a female soldier. In 1941, Xie Bingying published a short story collection, and the short story The Girl Wumeko is one of the stories in this collection, also the title of the book. So it tells the story about this Japanese girl who travels to China with so-called comfort team, primarily for the reason to find her husband, who is recruited to fight on the front lines in China. And after arriving in Wuhan, Wumeko actually finds out that her husband has already died during the war. And then she is forced to serve as a comfort woman in Wuhan. During her days in Wuhan, she is abused by Japanese soldiers and witnesses the Japanese soldiers rape Chinese women, bury Chinese men alive, kill Chinese children. So those atrocities make her to reconsider the meaning of war. So after half a year, she was relocated to Shashi, a city near Wuhan, to continue to be a comfort woman. In Shashi, she developed a romantic relationship with a Japanese pilot and eventually convinces him to join the Chinese army with her to fight against the Japanese. At the end of the story, the two are assigned by a Chinese general to join the Korean volunteer team, 朝鲜义勇队. So it's a Korean military unit fighting against the Japanese in China. So it was not a coincidence that the author Xie Bingying mentions Korean volunteer team in the story, because the Korean volunteer team was established in Wuhan in 1938 where Xie Binying got her military training, and the fictional character Wumiko became a comfort woman. So in the same year, in 1938, Chinese writer and communist revolutionary Shu Qun, he was assigned by Li Kenong, who was in charge of the CCP's intelligence department, to be the contact person for the Korean volunteer team. So Shu Qun was familiar with the Korean community in China at the time. He actually wrote a short story titled A Child Without a Country, published in 1936. So it's a story about a Korean boy's life in China. It is based on his friendship with a Korean boy in middle school in northeast China. So later, Shu Qun published a short story series titled The Ballads of Blood. The 8th story in this series is about a Korean comfort woman. So in addition to the literary representations of Japanese comfort women in Chinese wartime literature, there were also the literary representations of Korean comfort women. So the short story is about the Chinese army defeats a Japanese troop and rescues a 16-year-old Korean girl who was forced to serve as a comfort woman. And then the most of the short story is actually devoted to the sound of crying of this Korean girl. So the writer writes, it seems that she only has one simple feeling and one way to express her feeling. That is the sound of her crying. So in both Ballads of Blood and A Child Without a Country, Shu Qun actually laments the loss of one's motherland, because the Korean girl later explains that she cries because she feels that she will never get a chance to go back to her country again. And then another author, B, published a short story titled Hanako's Laments in the same year, in 1939. It tells a similar story about this Korean girl who is sold to Japan and abused by her Japanese husband. And later she is recruited by the Japanese government to serve as a comfort woman in China. She is rescued by some Chinese soldiers in Shanxi. And then the writer also writes about crying as well. So in this short story, the narrator, I, is a Chinese soldier. So one day, the Chinese soldier asks Hanako about her past when they are drinking together. So it reads, Hanako cried. She leaned over the edge of the table. Her curly hair trembled like a black peony in the wind because of her sadness. Her pitiful sobbing sound made my heart quiver. Suddenly, my tears began to fall into the wine cup. So the two cry together and form a very special friendship during the wartime. So in both Hanako's Laments and the Ballads of Blood, crying is a reminder of the tragic experience of the comfort women. The crying also evokes sympathy and delivers strong anti-war messages. Another example of the literary representation of Korean comfort women is Wang Jisi's classic Chinese poem, The Lament of a Korean Girl, published in 1940. So the poem is written from the perspective of this Korean girl who was forced to be a comfort woman. So the preface actually to the poem actually gives us some context. So it says, our troops attacked the Japanese army in Xinjiang and captured over 10 enemies. Among them, there were 2 Korean girls who were rescued by the enemy troop for the comfort unit to go to the front lines to be sexually abused. So in the poem, the Korean girl actually describes how she is forced to serve as a comfort woman. So it reads, the magnificent government issued a statement. It says that the front lines need comfort. Civilian girls cannot marry but wait for the imperial army to recruit them. So despite that, some Japanese ultra-rightists, they deny the Japanese government's involvement in the comfort women system. Wang Jis's poem and the later works we discussed earlier demonstrate that the comfort women system was institutionalized. So the literary works, historical records, news reports, they speak to each other and form and give us a more complete picture of wartime memories. For instance, Pan Shizheng, this military journalist, published a survey on the military prostitutes of enemy troops in 1944. It details the lives of comfort women in Tengchong, Yunnan province in China. Basically, in that period of time, after the defeat of the Japanese army in the Battle of Tengchong in China in September 1944, the Korean comfort women in Tengchong, they were either forced to commit suicide or executed by the Japanese army. So basically, the report details the life of Korean women in Tengchong. And Pan Shizheng's report was later verified by recently found materials and images. For example, in the year 2000, the Chinese citizen Xiong Weiyuan released photos of comfort women in Tengchong. So Xiong's family actually ran a photography studio in Tengchong back in 1940s. So after the Japanese occupation in Tengchong, Xiong's family fled the city. And then the Japanese army converted the photo studio into a comfort station. And then after the defeat of the Japanese army in September 1944, Xiong's family returned back to Tengchong and discovered the photos of comfort women. And then in 2017, the Seoul National University Human Rights Center actually released this video clip of Korean comfort women in Yunnan province, filmed by the U.S. Army in 1944. In 2018, the South Korean researchers, they released this video clip of Japanese Army's massacre of Korean comfort women in Tengchong in September 1944, which corresponds to Pan Shizheng's first-hand report during the wartime China. So the literary work, including reportage literature, they preserved the voices of comfort women and added to the historical records. So far, we mostly discussed the literary representations of Japanese and Korean comfort women in Chinese wartime literature. So the major themes includes the cruelty of the Japanese army, sympathy for comfort women, and anti-war messages. In contrast, the representations of Chinese comfort women, they are more complicated. They are not only expressing these anti-Japanese invasion messages, but also reflecting on patriarchal society and patriarchal nationalism under which the Chinese comfort women suffered. So for the discussion on the representations of Chinese comfort women, I want to go back to Dingling's wartime writings. So before publishing When I Was in Xian village, Dingling wrote another short story on women who suffered from wartime sexual violence, titled New Faith. So it tells the story of this Granny Chen who is raped by Japanese soldiers and witnesses the rape of her granddaughter and the kill of her grandson. So deeply traumatized by her experiences, she starts to offer her voice, telling her stories to inspire people to fight against the Japanese. So upon hearing her rallies, two female Chinese Communist Party cadres invite her to join the women's organization to increase her influence in mobilizing the masses. And then the telling is the major theme in this short story. So Granny Chen starts to tell her story to women in her family, but she avoids to tell her story in front of her sons because of the feelings of shame. She goes around to tell her neighbors about her sufferings, including how she was abused by the Japanese and how they forced a Chinese man to rape her in public. So at the end of the story, Granny Chen always shouts to the villagers, "You are not going to forget about this, are you?" So telling her stories for Granny Chen is a way to resist forgetting and to form a collective memory in the community. So her telling takes on another dimension after participating in the revolution. And then she travels to neighboring villages to tell her stories and encourage people to go on the front lines. By connecting her personal experiences to national salvation messages, Granny Chen rediscovered the meaning of her life, and she no longer feels ashamed in front of her sons. The power of telling also appeared in other wartime writings about women who were suffered from the sexual violence from the Japanese army. For instance, Ma Feng's short story, Jing Bao's Mother, it's about Jing Bao's mother, this peasant woman who was forced by a landlord actually to serve as a comfort woman. And after escaping the Japanese army, Jing Bao's mother has no choice but to become a prostitute to be able to raise her child and care for her mother-in-law. She is identified as a woman idoler, 女二流子, and she is publicly humiliated by being paraded through village streets. The story is based on the author's experience with the land reform in Jinsui region in 1947. So the narrator I in this story is a CCP cadre dispatched to this village to oversee land reform. And initially he despises Jinbao's mother, but after hearing about her tragic past, this CCP cadre helped her with getting her land during the land redistribution and helping her to participate in Speaking Bitterness campaign, 诉苦. So speaking bitterness during the CCP's land reform actually allows peasants to voice out their grievances and condemn landlords. So speaking bitterness actually empowers the peasants through telling their stories. So during a speaking bitterness meeting, Jinbao's mother tells her story about how she was forced by the landlord to serve as a comfort woman in the Japanese army. The meeting is depicted very vividly. It reads, Jinbao's mother initially begins talking while crying, then she passes out from anger. People spray her with cold water. All of a sudden, she acts crazy, springing up with her hair disheveled. She grins and bares her teeth as she jumps on the landlord Liu Huicai's body and bites him. So her pain and shame are alleviated after speaking out about her suffers. So ultimately, in both Jinbao's mother and New Face, telling is instructed by the Chinese Communist Party to form a collective political voice. So the question is, can those sexually abused women talk about their sufferings without political interventions? I think another two wartime short stories, they offer examples. In Cao Bing's The Humiliated, this woman worker Liang Akai in a silk factory in Shunde, Guangdong province, she is abducted by the Japanese to serve as a comfort woman. And after escaping the Japanese army, she constantly tells lies about her whereabouts during her experience for the fear of being judged if she tells the truth. So telling lies for her is a way to avoid possible further humiliations. But this local hooligan who collaborates with the Japanese discovers her secret, and her lies are about to be exposed. In addition, her only hope to go back to work has been shattered because the only machine in the silk factory has been sold to the Japanese. So in desperation, Liang Akai attempts to destroy the machine and passes out next to it. So basically, Liang Akai cannot reclaim her dignity or job back without political guidance. In Liu Qing's short story, the woman who was raped, Zhao Kuan's wife is kidnapped by the Japanese army, and then after a month, she found out that she was pregnant, but she was not sure if the father is Zhao Kuan or one of the Japanese soldiers who raped her. So after giving birth to a boy, she is abducted by the Japanese soldier again and becomes insane. And then she returns back home and killed her child and goes on the streets to tell everyone how she was comforting the imperial army, 慰劳皇军. In contrast to Granny Chen's structured speeches with national salvation messages, Zhao Huan's wife's repeated tellings of her stories are disorganized and insane without any political leadership. So basically, from the literary works we described here, the voices of comfort women, they cannot really erase their pain and shame unless they are incorporated into the grand historical narrative of Chinese Revolution or the national salvation. Right? So, because this kind of a revolutionary ideology indicates that the loss of chastity is the indication of the weakness of the nation. But Dingling's short story, When I Was in Xia Village, challenges this kind of a national salvation narrative by focusing on the wronged woman herself. So Dingling's When I Was in Xia Village tells the story about this village girl named Zhenzhen, whose name actually means chastity. She is abducted by the Japanese to serve as a comfort woman, and later works for the Chinese Communist Party as a spy. She endures both physical and the mental sufferings serving as a comfort woman and a spy. She has a venereal disease, and the dominant voices in this short story is villagers spreading rumors about her being unchaste. Her only hope is to go to Yan'an, the headquarters of the CCP, for treatment. But the author Dingling is very ambiguous about the future of Zhenzhen in Yan'an. This is also the most controversial part of the story. During the anti-rightist movement in 1950s, the author Dingling was criticized for glorifying the women who were raped by the Japanese in New Faith and in When I Was in Xia Village. And Zhenzhen was condemned as a military prostitute who loses her chastity and integrity, 师姐. So Zhenzhen's story is an example of Louise Edwards' concept of crisis femininity, which grants women the right to disrupt gender norms for the sake of national salvation. But once the crisis has been resolved, then the women who disrupt gender norms, they cannot be remembered by the nation, or their stories need to be rewritten to conform to the gender norms. So, as Dingling indicates in the short story, despite making enormous emotional, physical sacrifices to the revolution, Zhenzhen has little chance to be included in the official narrative of Chinese Revolution because she loses her chastity. So this kind of a patriarchal nationalism assigns women this impossible task of sacrificing yourself sexually, but at the same time remain chaste, especially after the crisis subsided. So after analyzing all the literary works during the wartime, it is clear that the representations of comfort women, they are closely related to, or their voices of comfort women are closely related to or incorporated into this nationalist framework. But we are actually losing large part of the story if we only remember comfort women within a nationalist framework. So long after the end of the war, the victims of the comfort women, they kept silent because of this kind of a cultural and a political pressure that stigmatizes raped women as unchaste and view them as the traces of national pain. So in 1991, Kim Hak-sun, a Korean comfort woman survivor, broke the silence, and then more individual voices emerged. But the voices of Chinese comfort women, they are mostly unheard beyond Asia. So for the rest of my talk, I want to focus on two recent Chinese documentaries on comfort women survivors in China. So back in 2012, Guo Ke, a young Chinese director, read a report about Wei Shaolan, a comfort woman survivor in Guangxi province in China, and decided to make a documentary about her. And then the short documentary 32 actually was released in 2013. Encouraged by positive response to this short documentary and emerging awareness of the decreasing number of the comfort women survivors in China, the director decided to make another documentary on 22 comfort women survivors in China in 2014. So the documentary 22 was actually finished in 2015, but not publicly screened until 2017 because of the financial issues with the distribution and the publicities. The director was inspired by the successful crowdfunding campaign for the production of a Korean film, Spirit's Homecoming, in 2016. And then the director initiated the crowdfunding campaign to support the distribution of the documentary 22. So 30,000 people donated to the film within 3 months. So with the support of the crowdfunding participants, the documentary was released on August 14th, 2017, the International Memorial Day for Comfort Women. The first day occupancy rates for this film actually surpassed that of another film in the theater at the same time, Wolf Warrior 2, which is one of the most popular films actually in the history of Chinese film. At the end of the documentary, the director actually paid special thanks to the crowdfunding participants by listing all their names on screen. I think this list is very long and powerful. I think it's very powerful to show this collective voice and support for comfort women. This listing all the names of the crowdfunding participants was also inspired by this Korean film, Spirit's Homecoming. So although my talk today is mostly about Chinese literature and film, I want to say a few words about two Korean films, also focusing on the voices of comfort women. One is Spirit's Homecoming, which tells the story of this, how the voices and the spirit of this deceased comfort woman were channeled by a shaman, and her spirit actually returns back home to reunite with her parents. And then the other one, I Can Speak, is a comedy and drama, which is about this Korean comfort woman survivor who learns to speak English in order to testify at a public hearing for comfort women in the US to bring the voice of comfort women to the international stage. The two films, they are very, very successful in Korea. Back to the documentary 32 and 22, they are also very successful in China, raising the awareness of comfort women issues. So the title of the documentaries 32 and 22 refer to the number of comfort women survivors in China at the time of filming. What's so special about the documentaries is that they are not concentrating on the nationalist narratives of comfort women or the politics of comfort women, but rather the daily lives of comfort women survivors. So the director adopted this kind of a non-interactive method of filming, and he insisted on not including any dramas in the films. As you can see, there are a lot of scenery shots from the two documentaries of the rain, trees, mountains, and rivers, which slow down the documentary. The director intentionally not including any historical narratives or voiceover in the films, but rather present comfort women's daily lives without questioning or interrupting. So he explains this kind of a restrained approach in an interview, stating that if you consider the comfort women survivors as your grandmas, then you wouldn't be so cruel to continue to ask questions about their traumatic past. So the director and his team, they are mostly listeners rather than interviewers. When the comfort women survivors, they don't feel like talking, and then the director switches camera to the scenery shots. After talking about some the general style and approach of these documentaries, I want to talk about the documentaries in detail. So 32 is a documentary about comfort women survivor Wei Shaolan and her half-Japanese son, Luo Shanxue. So Wei Shaolan was abducted by the Japanese army to serve as a comfort woman in 1944. So after 3 months, she luckily escaped and returned home and found out that she was pregnant. And her husband accused her being unchaste. She attempted suicide but was saved by her neighbors. So her story parallels the story of Zhao Kuan's wife in the woman who was raped in that wartime story. So later she gave birth to Luo Shanxue. So Shanxue actually means good at studying in Chinese. But ironically, Luo Shanxue dropped out of school at a very young age because the discrimination and isolation in school because of his identity. He's still referred to as a Japanese devil nowadays. So Wei Shaolan is the only comfort women survivor who publicly acknowledged that her son is half Japanese. Despite the difficult living situation, Wei Shaolan's attitude toward suffering and also her optimism about life is inspiring and contagious. She always says that the world is so great, 这世界真好. So this is the poster for 32. As you can see, that it's very poetic, like a landscape painting. So the majority of the poster depicts the mountains and the rivers in Guangxi province where Wei Shaolan lives. The poster features a quote from Wei Shaolan, which says, "The world is really great. Keep living to see it, even if it means eating only wild vegetables." So next, I want to briefly talk about the documentary 22, which focuses on 22 comfort women survivors in China. I want to briefly talk about two of them. The first one is Lin Ailan from Hainan province. She joined a Chinese communist troop when she was 15 years old. And then she was abducted by the Japanese army to be a comfort woman when she was 17 years old. While she was in the army, she stole ammunition for the Chinese communist troops. So she was a communist revolutionary like Zheng Zhen when I was in Xia village. In 2005, the Chinese government honored her with a memorial badge commemorating the 60th anniversary of the victory of anti-Japanese war. So her contribution to the revolution was finally recognized. And then the other one is Mao Yingmei, who was originally from Korea. She was deceived into coming to China, believing she would work in a sock factory. But she ended up being forced to be a comfort woman in Wuhan. So her stories share a lot of similarities with Xie Bingling's short story, The Girl Wumeko. So the Wumeko also works as a comfort woman in Wuhan. And then after the end of the war, Mao Yingmei moved to Xiaogan, a city near Wuhan, and changed her Korean name into a Chinese name with the surname Mao out of the respect for Mao Zedong. What strikes me the most is that she can speak multiple dialects and languages. She mainly speaks Hubei dialect. And she can also speak a little bit Japanese she learned when she was in comfort station. And she can also remember and sing Korean folk songs from her childhood. Childhood and girlhood are two major themes commemorating comfort women to preserve the images of innocent youth and to condemn the cruelty of the comfort women system. For instance, this is the famous statue commemorating comfort women, the Statue of Peace, established in Korea in 2011. It evokes the youth of comfort women. In 2016, a comfort women memorial statue with a Chinese girl and a Korean girl was established at Shanghai Normal University alongside with the opening of the Chinese Comfort Women Museum. And then this poster for 22 uses a very similar concept, depicting a girl drawing the face of a comfort woman as a girl. So the poster remembers comfort women as girls, innocent young girls, while depicting the passing down of the memory of comfort women to the next generation. I think the documentaries 22 and 32, they are significant in passing down the memories of comfort women to the next generation. The stories in the documentaries, they echo a lot of wartime writings in 1930s and 40s in China. And they preserve the primary materials for us to remember comfort women, their joys and sufferings. They recorded the voices of comfort women with respect and dignity. I think the most moving presentation of the voices of comfort women survivors in the documentaries is singing. So singing brings women the joy and transports them back to their childhood or girlhood, a time before the horrors of war. So I want to end my talk with having all of us listening to Wei Shaolan and Mao Yingmei's singing.
아리롱 아리롱 아라리요 아리랑 고개를 넘어간다 나를 버리고 가시는 님은 심리도 못 가서 발견하네 그러니까 ngayon 저라 붙은 저 타요 저 좁으지로 알아서 좋더냐 아리랑 아라리요 아리랑 고개로 넘어간다
他要他回家回去看看去，他呢年纪太大了，不回去，他呢麻烦，他说不麻烦，坐飞机，他说2个小时就到啊，不回去，他说家乡又没得亲人。
이게 자꾸 술이 싸나 신혼차에 알리기 잘해 다들 참고 오래 시원해 도라지 신신산천의 도라지 신신산천의 도라지 캐러 간다고 요리 핑기 저리 핑기 대더니 청강 남구 무덤에 산모지 찐내로만 건너 에헤요 난다 기마 찾아 좋다 네가 내 간장을 솔살살 다 녹인다.
So this is Wei Shaolan singing a Guangxi folk song. She really likes and learned this song when she was a little girl.
Lâu na lâu tháng cổ chân chi na mai bi ni chi ba ở chi ở tháng cổ yên cổ châu thông san đi lo chu la đi về hồng ta đến lấy hàng mi hai không 我们海里空的好耍，我几愁面都没愁穷，一条江水直悠悠，一朵莲花在面包，可惜呀真没花去，你不真容易看花后。 大田这是我房，不变毛豆不变样，养一个花生的的钱，我猜你掉去哪一家？你笑我一笑，坏了。 小木有愁， 见证他们活活着，我等他们的那来了。你讲那我没信，我讲我那啥是真，那这有贫无趣，我那有在苦瓜的碰。天上路一路要滑，自家对着自家跑，自己摇头自己改，自来不应该自骂开。膝盖真好，吃东西对了，都是正面的来看。
Thank you so much for listening